Hi, I'm Ursula Wake and this is Lyrical Wax.
And I'm John Atack. Today, because it's an anniversary, the 13th of January, is the anniversary of the death of James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, who was born in Dublin on the 2nd of February 1882 and was one of the oldest of 10 surviving siblings of John Joyce and May Joyce. So we're going to celebrate the life of James Joyce by going chronologically through.
We are going chronologically, aren't we? Yeah.
And I should say that when I was sort of about 20 years old, I was completely obsessed with James Joyce. The idea was that Joyce was the greatest writer of prose that the English language had ever seen, and that was pretty much the idea, as the greatest novelist. And so I immersed myself, but I not only didn't manage to read Finnegans Wake,
like most people,
but I only got halfway through Ulysses as well.
like
twice.
most people.
Twice. Yeah, W.B. Yeats said he thought it was a great book, but he couldn't manage to read it or something like that. Okay, so his first volume of poetry, Chamber Music, was published, I think, in 1907, was it? Somewhere around
Yes, yeah.
there. And Ursula is going to pass the piece of paper over now.
So he published, so there were 2 volumes of poetry. Chamber Music, there's 36 poems in it, and the last one, Poems Penny Each, is quite short. There's only about 16 poems in it, so there's not many.
There is a collected poems during his lifetime which adds some poems to that.
Okay.
But
yeah. So, and he's definitely better known as a prose writer. So we're going to start off with the first poem that he published.
The first poem from Chamber Music.
Yeah. And then I think as we come back to some of the later works, we'll see quite a change in it, in his in the style of his writing, and we can sort of see how it develops. So, because I was really taken with how traditional and
conservative
his early poetry is. So here's an example of something that, to be honest, we weren't very impressed by.
And he's, what, about 25 at this time?
Yeah.
So, by this time, John Keats is already dead. He's already done his whole work. So, come on, James Joyce, work harder.
So, this is called Strings in the Earth and Air. Strings in the earth and air make music sweet. Strings by the river where the willows meet. There's music along the river, for love wanders there. Pale flowers on his mantle, dark leaves on his hair. All softly playing, with head to the music bent, and fingers straying upon an instrument.
There is some contention about the title of the collection. It's called Chamber Music. And Richard Ellman, the great biographer of Joyce, who wrote a massive tome, which I did read, even though I couldn't finish Ulysses or read Finnegans Wake. He says he had in 1949 a conversation with Eva Joyce. I'm not really sure who she is, actually, now I look at that. His sister, presumably. That the chamber music connotation had its origin in a visit that Joyce made, accompanied by Oliver Gogarty, who would become Buck Mulligan in Ulysses, one of the characters, to a young widow named Jenny, in May of 1904. And the 3 of them drank porter, Irish beer, while Joyce read manuscript versions of the poems aloud. At one point, Jenny retreated behind a screen to make use of a chamber pot. And Gogarty commented, "There's a critic for you." When Joyce later told this story to his brother Stanislaus, his brother agreed that it was a favourable omen. So, chamber music. And here is another of the poems from chamber music. Because your voice was at my side, I gave him pain. Because within my hand I held your hand again. There is no word nor any sign can make amend. He is a stranger to me now, who was my friend.
Very poignant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is. But it does, you know, as we've said, it doesn't sort of elevate him, you know, alongside, say, W.B. Yeats, who's his, you know, older contemporary. You don't sort of look at that and go, you know, how can you tell the dance from the dance? It's not got any of those punchy lines,
No.
even though it is a well-written piece. And you wouldn't suspect from it that this man. And I think the thing about Joyce's prose is that I view it as blank verse. I view it as poetic, you know, full of the devices that are normal to poetry. And yet his poetry is relatively simple, though
Yeah.
well written.
So we're going to move on now to some of his prose. And one of my favourite pieces by Joyce is I Love Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories. And one of the stories, the longest one, is called The Dead. In it, husband and wife are in bed. Husband, Gabriel, has found out at the party they've just been at that his wife, who was very moved by a song that was sung, was so moved because it reminded her of a love in her youth who died while waiting for her in the cold outside her window.
As so often happens.
Don't try this at home.
No.
So this is the end of the story, The Dead. The air of the room chilled his shoulders. He stretched himself cautiously along under the sheets and lay down beside his wife. One by one they were all becoming shades. Better pass boldly into that other world, in the full glory of some passion, than fade and wither dismally with age. He thought of how she who lay beside him had locked in her heart for so many years that image of her lover's eyes when he had told her that he did not wish to live. Generous tears filled Gabriel's eyes. He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a grey, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill, where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead. Remarkable, I think. So it's straightforward language, and it's traditional structure. There's none of the stream of consciousness that he became so famous for, but stunning.
Absolutely.
Stunning piece of writing.
The film director John Huston, for many years, the great film director John Huston, wanted to make a film of the dead, and it was his last film with his daughter Angelica. and it's a wonderful film. Though I would, as always, for me, you read the book before you watch the film. You must, because otherwise things spoil. There are very few exceptions to that for me. And it's a wonderful short story. He was very influenced by Chekhov. He was especially influenced by a Norwegian writer called Knut Hamsun, so much so that he learned to read Dano-Norwegian so he could read them in the original and read Ibsen. And these are stories which move away from the traditional, beginning, middle, end of a story. And as with Chekhov, you get the middle. And you are told something, often something very profound, which is not just a little story about something. Joyce had terrible trouble getting the book published because a publisher accepted it and then refused to publish it. And it meant that he was contracted to the publisher and couldn't do anything about it. And it was held.
That's a poor show.
Yeah, it's not the only time it's happened to a writer either. Eventually, he managed, I think, in 1914, shortly before the First War started, to have it published. But it still didn't make him famous. It still didn't make him any money. He lived in poverty in Trieste. And is now, it's regarded as one of the great works, Dubliners, certainly. We have a curiosity. In the year that it was finally published, 1914, Joyce wrote privately about an affair he'd had. And it was long thought that he'd been entirely faithful to his wife, Nora Barnacle, what a wonderful name.
Fantastic name.
Who was a chambermaid who he picked up one night, and I think may have been the only person she may have taken his virginity on that first night. And off they ran to Trieste. But after his death, this manuscript was found, and it's published as Giacomo Joyce, which is his sort of alter ego that he's creating for himself. And I think it's quite remarkable that it was not used during his lifetime, because it is such a beautiful piece of writing. It's very short as well, for anybody that wants something that's only 16 pages long, so they can say they've read a James Joyce book. It's like, oh yes, I've read Steinbeck, I've read Of Mice and Men. So this is the last passage. He calls out to his wife Nora in the middle of it. And there's one phrase in it which you probably better explain, because I certainly wouldn't have understood it without a footnote. And that is non hunc sed Barabbam, which I think is Latin.
Sounds like it. What does it mean, John?
It comes from the Gospel of John, and it means literally, no, not him, give us Barabbas. But it comes from a point in John, which is John 18:38-40, where the crowd are given. So
this is the Bible.
Let's
make this clear.
Sorry, yes.
We haven't said that.
Yep. The Gospel of John, and the passage in the Gospel reads, "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him," against Jesus. "But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. So elsewhere I think he's called a thief in other translations. But I did go carefully through 9 translations and decided that was my favourite. So you've got the idea that rather than releasing Jesus, they're going to release a terrorist.
Right.
Or a robber.
So I'm intrigued how this fits into the story of an affair.
Yeah. And we're all going to have to work that out for ourselves. So this is from Giacomo Joyce. A soft, crumpled pea-green cover drapes the lounge. A lounge in this case being a sofa.
Okay.
Yeah. A soft, crumpled pea-green cover drapes the lounge. A narrow Parisian room. The hairdresser lay here, but now I kissed her stocking and the hem of her rust-black dusty skirt. It is the other, she. Gogoti came yesterday to be introduced. Ulysses is the reason, symbol of the intellectual conscience. Ireland, then? And the husband? Pacing the corridor in list shoes or playing chess against himself. Why are we left here? The hairdresser lay here but now, clutching my head between her knobby knees. Intellectual symbol of my race. Listen! The plunging gloom has fallen. Listen. I am not convinced that such activities of the mind or body can be called unhealthy. She speaks. A weak voice from beyond the cold stars, voice of wisdom, say on, oh say again, making me wise, the voice I never heard. She coils towards me along the crumpled lounge. I cannot move or speak. Coiling approach of star-born flesh, adultery of wisdom. No, I will go. I will. Jim, love. Soft, sucking lips kiss my left armpit. A coiling kiss on myriad veins. I burn. I crumple like a burning leaf. From my right armpit, a fang of flame leaps out. A starry snake has kissed me. A cold night snake. I am lost. Nora! Jan Peter Svelink, the quaint name of the old Dutch musician, makes all beauty seem quaint and far. I hear his variations for the clavichord on an old air, Youth Has an End. In the vague mist of old sounds, a faint point of light appears. The speech of the soul is about to be heard. Youth has an end. The end is here. It will never be. You know that when? What then? Write it. Damn you, write it. What else are you good for? Why? Because otherwise I could not see you. Sliding space, ages, foliage of stars and waning heavens, stillness and stillness deeper, stillness of annihilation, and her voice. None hunk said Barabbas. Unreadiness, a bare apartment, torpid daylight, a long black piano, coffin of music, poised on its edge, a woman's hat, red-flowered, and umbrella, furled, her arms, a casque, gules, and blunt spear on a field sable. Envoy, love me, love my umbrella. It's unique in that it's a piece of work that is not finished for publication. And Joyce is, it's Finnegans Wake took 17 years in the making.
I'm not surprised.
And so here he is writing this thing for himself, never intending to publish it. And I think it shows, again, he talks about Gogoti, Oliver St. John Gogoti, Buck Mulligan, who is a central character in Ulysses and was a reasonably well-known poet. You'll find his work in anthologies, but he just appears. It's almost these are notes.
Yeah, if he wasn't intending to have it published, then James Joyce, you're forgiven because it's just you're doing what you're doing. So that's fair enough.
And if you take just one little passage, he says, she speaks, a weak voice from beyond the cold stars, voice of wisdom, say on, oh say again, making me wise. This voice I never heard. And so there's this self-deprecating little comment. But as with so much in Joyce, you have to keep going back to it and back to it to actually mine from it what he's saying. And in this case, he probably doesn't actually say it. So, that he hints towards things. But again, you have his incredible poetic use of language. She coils towards me along the crumpled lounge.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
And the adultery of wisdom.
And maybe he was just part of him developing the language, the kind of prose writing that he then became more famous for.
This is while he's working on Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man in its first draft, which is a manuscript called Stephen Hero, which he tried to burn, in fact. And it was rescued from the flames and has been published. But he decided to throw it all away and start again, having written this great big book, and writes The Portrait of the Artist, which is a turning point in literature, certainly.
Yeah. And we're about to have a bit of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So actually this piece that I'm going to read is, in terms of a piece of prose, it's full of complete sentences, which you don't always get. And as a paragraph, it's very coherent. So Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man it's kind of autobiography, but written in the third person about a character called Stephen Dedalus. His James Joyce's sort of fictional alter ego, to be able to kind of...
Who will persist into Ulysses.
Yeah, this piece is a conversation about different types of art. So it is quite unusual, if I think about the book as a whole. There isn't that much of this kind of stuff in there, because it's famous for that stream of consciousness writing.
And he also seeks to write from the age he was. So it starts with a baby voice and expands out, and the early things he remembers, and the language becomes richer as he grows older.
Yeah. So this is a conversation between Stephen and somebody called Lynch. Stephen went on. Pity is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites it with the human sufferer. Terror is the feeling which arrests the mind in the presence of whatsoever is grave and constant in human sufferings, and unites it with the secret cause. Repeat, said Lynch. Stephen repeated the definition slowly. A girl got into a hansom a few days ago, he went on, in London. She was on her way to meet her mother, whom she had not seen for many years. At the corner of a street, the shaft of a lorry shivered the window of the hansom in the shape of a star. A long, fine needle of the shivered glass pierced her heart. She died on the instant. The reporter called it a tragic death. It is not. It is remote from terror and pity according to the terms of my definitions. The tragic emotion, in fact, is a face looking two ways, towards terror and towards pity, both of which are phases of it. You see, I use the word arrest. I mean that the tragic emotion is static, or rather the dramatic emotion is. The feelings excited by improper art are kinetic. Desire or loathing. Desire urges us to possess, to go to something. Loathing urges us to abandon, to go from something. The arts which excite them, pornographic or didactic, are therefore improper arts. The aesthetic emotion, I use the general term, is therefore static. The mind is arrested and raised above desire and loathing. That's worth revisiting, probably, because it's quite dense as a description of something. But the whole book is about his awakening, Stephen Daedalus's religious awakening, intellectual awakening, and yeah. So this is quite an interesting piece in it.
Joseph Campbell, the great writer on mythology, elevates Joyce and says, that putting aside traditional religion, we should look towards a creative mythology that is made by our artists. And so rather than having all of the rituals and the holiness and all of that stuff, the mythology is made. And he names Thomas Mann, he names Picasso, but he is essentially, one book after another, returns to that particular passage where he's saying there are three forms of art. There is the art which attracts you, which is pornographic. You wish to possess it, you move towards it. There is the art that repulses you, repels you, and that is didactic. It's seeking to teach you something, which I would say is, a statement about much of modern contemporary conceptualism, that people are trying to teach you something, Tracy Emin or Damien Hirst. And, usually it's something you already know. That's the problem that I have with much of the work that we see. But there is a didactic aim in conceptualism to make you realise something. And Joyce then says there is the third form, which is transcendent, which is that art which stands you stock still. You can't move. You are struck by it, which is very much the experience I had of, say, Velázquez's Crucifixion, seeing it in the Prado, or Caravaggio's Supper at Emmaus in the National Gallery, or Rembrandt's Girl Standing Water, that I am spellbound. And Joyce in this is talking about his quest for the Holy Grail, which is to understand spirituality not within the terms of the Catholic Church in which he was raised. It's to have a unique and personal experience, direct experience of the world, rather than it being, via the texts of others, or, learning from a book. And it makes him an archetypal artist, that he is, he's concerned with his own vision of the world, rather than passing on anybody else's vision or, extending that. So I think that's why I pulled the passage out, because having read as much Campbell as I have, I thought it was about time that the actual Joyce passage was read rather than Campbell's interpretation of it, which is what I've just given. It's a very important book. It's published in, I think, 1917, and it will have an incredible influence.
1916 it was published.
Okay, 1916.
But, yeah.
And it leads, it's his preparation, it's him getting ready for Ulysses, the masterwork. Stephen Dedalus, he chooses the name because St. Stephen was the first martyr of the Christian Church, and he's talking about the newness of his revelation. And Dedalus because he is the great sort of Da Vinci character, the huge genius of Greek mythology, who of course builds the labyrinth for the Minotaur and flees with his son Icarus, and Icarus fails to follow his advice, flies too close to the sun because the Greeks didn't realise it gets cold as you get higher, and the wax melts in his wings, and he becomes a symbol generation on generation for artists. And so it is that Joyce adopts the role of the father, the wise man, rather than the role of Icarus, and is saying, I come with this new creation, which Ulysses will truly be.
Yeah. Yep.
Which leads us to Ulysses. And we're not going to read the whole book, all 900 pages, but this is a small part. Ulysses is there are 18 episodes in it, and they are the 18 episodes of the Odyssey by Homer, the 10-year journey that Ulysses makes after the Trojan War to return to his wife Penelope. And what Joyce does is he takes a single day in June 1904, Bloomsday, is it the 16th of June?
16th of June, it's become Bloomsday because of Leopold Bloom,
and the
character. But it was the day that he met Nora Barnacle.
Yeah, and so
that's
he's,
the day that it settled.
that she, in a back alley.
That's very coy of you to just... They had sex.
Well, no, she gave him a hand job, if we're going to be non-coy, and that was his introduction to womanly wilds. And so he celebrates that. And there are two characters who are essential to Ulysses: Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. And this is a day in the life. Going through these 18 episodes. Each episode is written in a different style. One is actually written in Elizabethan English. The book was banned for many years as pornographic. particularly because of the final section, which is Molly Bloom, Leopold Bloom's wife, who, let's say, has been somewhat sexually unfaithful to him quite frequently. And it's her stream of consciousness as she lies in bed and she thinks, there's no punctuation, she just is thinking about her sexual encounters. She talks about menstruation, which was considered not something we meant to talk about. And it's a quite remarkable
that passage
piece of prose. We're going into episode 8, which is the Lestrygonians, who are giants who are encountered by Ulysses in his voyages. Grafton Street, gay with housed awnings, lured his senses. Muslin prints, silk, dames and dowagers, jingle of harnesses, hoof thuds low ringing in the baking causeway. Thick feet that woman has in the white stockings. Hope the rain mucks them up on her. Country bred chaw bacon, all the beef to the heels were in. Always gives a woman clumsy feet. Molly looks out of plum. He passed, dallying, the windows of Brown Thomas, silk mercers. Cascades of ribbons, flimsy china silks, a tilted urn poured from its mouth a flood of blood-hued poplin. Lustrous blood. The Huguenots brought that here. La cosa è santa. Tara, Tara. Great chorus that. Tara must be washed in rainwater. Meyerbeer. Tara. Bomb, bomb, bomb. Pincushions. I'm a long time threatening to buy one. Stick them all over the place. Needles in window curtains. He bared slightly his left forearm. Scrape. Nearly gone. Not today, anyhow. Must go back for that lotion. For her birthday, perhaps. June, July, August, September 8th. Nearly 3 months off. Then she mightn't like it. Women won't pick up pins. Say it cuts low. Gleaming silks, petticoats on slim brass rails, rays of flat silk stockings. Useless to go back. Had to be. Tell me all. High voices, sun-warm silk, jingling harnesses, all for a woman. Home and houses, silk webs, silver, rich fruits, spicy from Jaffa. Agendath Netaim, wealth of the world. A warm, human plumpness settled down on his brain. His brain yielded. Perfume of embraces all him assailed. With hungered flesh, obscurely, he mutely craved to adore. Duke Street. Here we are. Must eat. The Burton. Feel better then. He turned, Combridge's corner, still pursued, jingling hoof thuds, perfumed bodies, warm, full, all kissed, yielded, in deep summer fields, tangled, pressed grass, in trickling hallways of tenements, along sofas, creaking beds. The line in there that brings me to it is perfume of embraces all in a sail.
Yeah.
And Joyce said he had all of the words at the beginning of the day, but it took him the whole day to put them in the right order. And the reference, perfume of embraces all him assailed, is to women's underwear on a washing line, white bloomers, and thusly assailed with the word sail in it. And he is forever playing these little tricks where you go to the words and you find that he's saying something else at the same time. And it's a sexual passage, and yet it's about material. It's about silks and things like this.
Fabrics. Yeah. So I think that's quite a good example of what Ulysses is like as a book. Yeah.
The stream of consciousness where he is, and again, it's a book that took him 5 years to write. And he's, largely during that time, his poor brother Stanislaus came over to Trieste from Dublin so that he could work and make money so that Joyce could spend most of his time either drinking or writing. That's what we know about him.
Yeah.
But poor Stanislaus, who did have a talent as a writer himself, spent his life supporting his brother instead.
Right.
So,
Okay.
but whatever. It's the kind of Theo and Vincent van Gogh story, and I am going to go back for a third time and try and read it now.
Is that your challenge for 2021?
That's my challenge for the next 10 years. I think I said Arturo Rubinstein, the phenomenal interpreter of Chopin, pianist, brilliant man. At the age of 90, he said that he found that he was going blind, and that meant that he would now have to read Proust and Ulysses because they can't be read to you.
Right.
And I would say with Ulysses that I do consider it to be a poetic work, that it veers so far that way, rather than a prose work. And so for comparison, it's 900 pages, and if we said that each of those pages is 3 poems, then we've got 2,700 poems to negotiate to get through it. And I stuck 2 times. I've got halfway through it. I was stopped because I didn't know what he was talking about.
Exactly. That's why
and you had to go to the dictionary and trying to find out what he meant, and then you come back to one of these astonishing single lines: perfume of embraces, all him assailed, or ineluctable modality of the visible is the one that's also lodged in my brain. That he is, and I think there's a mystification there as well. That Joyce, when he met with T.S. Eliot for the second time, Ezra Pound had taken him over before the First World War to meet Joyce, and Joyce had thought nothing of it. And then after The Wasteland is published in, I think, 22, and Ulysses has come out at the same time, and he's introduced again to him, Joyce looks at Ezra Pound and says, "You didn't tell me he was a poet." And then he gives advice to Eliot. He says, "Never explain," because in The Wasteland there are notes about the fire sermon and where things came from. And he's like, "Never explain." And there's a statement about Ulysses that when the proofs were read back to him, his eyesight was very poor, it had to be read back to him. And it's littered with typographical errors because it was a handwritten manuscript that had gone and been typed.
Okay.
It's littered with them. And he would listen to what the mistake was, and he'd say, "Let it stand," because he liked it. And so I think there is a deliberate mystification and making him seem,
And he famously said about Finnegans Wake, this will keep the critics busy for 200 years or something.
200 years.
So yeah, he was amazing. Also, up himself.
Yeah, he
was both of those things.
Weirdly narcissistic and brilliant, a kind of David Bowie character, in some ways. But he ushers in modern literature, and I think things have changed during the 45 years since I was obsessed with him. The situation's changed. Other writers have advanced, and it's not just the Joyce and the others.
No.
We now accept that, say Joseph Heller's Catch-22 should be considered on a par with or Moby Dick. That there are other novels that reach a pinnacle. Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain, and Joyce has come down a peg. In reading about him, I read Ellman's very long biography. I then read Stan Gabler Davis's very fine biography of him. But then I found it, and I'd read Anthony Burgess wrote a book, a fine novelist, Here Comes Everyone, which is HCE, these letters that keep repeating through Finnegans Wake, for the name Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker. But I found it a real gem, a book called James Joyce Remembered by Constantine Curran. And he'd gone to university with Joyce, and he pointed out that, he absolutely revered Joyce's work. And no doubt about that, including Finnegans Wake. He thought it was quite remarkable. But he wanted to point out that every comment made about philosophy in the complete corpus of Joyce's work came from the primer that they read at university.
So the introductory work, you mean, a primer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What the Americans call a primer, I'm told. some reason, unbeknownst to me. And that his claim to have 12 languages is not quite true, that he spoke fluent Italian, fluent French, and fluent English, but he did a course in Erse, the Irish language, didn't really get through it, but it meant he could pop these words out and sound grander than he was. So, we've now hacked him down to size. This is a poem that I really do like, and I absolutely agree with you that his poems are not, his prose is absolutely startling. His poems tend to be conventional. This is the poem Ecce Pua, which is Latin, and looking at translations, I come to behold the boy child. Behold the young boy is used, but I think behold the boy child. This is about the birth of his grandson, and written immediately after the birth of his grandson, and a few months after the death of his father, who he loved. He had a great tenor voice, apparently, John Joyce. So here we are, he's reflecting on his father and his grandchild. Ecce Pua. Of the dark past, a child is born. With joy and grief, my heart is torn. Calm in his cradle the living lies, may love and mercy unclose his eyes. Young life is breathed on the glass, the world that was not comes to pass. The child is sleeping, an old man gone. O Father forsaken, forgive your son. The unclose his eyes for the child is the reversal of the practice with the dead of closing the eyes.
Yeah.
And he felt that he'd abandoned his father because he'd moved away to Trieste shortly after meeting Nora Barnacle, and only made a couple of trips back.
Yeah, they
for the rest
barely
of his
ever
life.
went back. Yeah, they lived in all sorts of places, but barely ever went back to Ireland, didn't they?
Much in Trieste, and then in Paris, and then
Zurich.
in Zurich, a bit in between. Fairly briefly, I think, because he dies on the way back from Paris to Zurich. Very poignant.
Yeah.
And he says, in fact, Joyce said that he'd drawn much of his literary inspiration from his father, crediting him, in fact, with the paternity of Ulysses, the book. And where he said, the humour is his, its people are his friends, it's his spitting image.
So this next piece, another poem, is not about his grandson, but about his son.
Giorgio Joyce.
And it's called On the Beach at Fontana. Wind whines and winds the shingle, the crazy pier stakes groan. A senile sea numbers each single slime-silvered stone. From whining wind and colder grey sea, I wrap him warm and touch his trembling fine-boned shoulder and boyish arm. Around us fear, descending darkness of fear above, and in my heart, how deep, unending ache of love. That's one of those images I've come across, and when we've been preparing things for these episodes, and we've been at some point we'll do something about parenthood, fatherhood, motherhood, something like that, and there are lots of poems about sort of little moments that a parent writes about where all of a sudden just something's happening, sometimes something quite small, but there's just this surge of love for their child. Deep, unending ache of love.
So the Brian Patton poem that you put into another episode, writing about his child.
Well, we'll be coming on to there's an Adrian Mitchell one.
Adrian Mitchell. Mitchell.
So it will
That's
be.
what I'm thinking of.
We will be coming on to.
That will be published at some point.
Yes, we will be doing an episode, I'm sure, on parenthood, because there's too many good things to not do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is it's a poem called A Memory of the Players in a mirror at midnight.
So that one, can I just say, and because that poem that I've just read, and these two are all from the second collection of poems penny each. Yep. And so they're quite different from chamber music, especially the next two.
And the volume cost £1, which was 12 pennies. I think you got one for free, so it was a baker's dozen of 13 or something.
Oh right, so the number of poems. Yeah, I said 14 or 16, so presumably it's 12 or 13 then.
I think so. Yeah. So there will be a test at the end, by the way. A memory of the players in a mirror at midnight. They mouth love's language, gnash the 13 teeth, your lean jaws grin with, lash, your itch and quailing nude greed of the flesh. Love's breath in you is stale, worded or sung, as sour as cat's breath, harsh of tongue. This grey that stares lies not, stark skin and bone, leave greasy lips there kissing, none will choose her, what you see to mouth upon. Dire hunger holds his hour. Pluck forth your heart, salt blood, a fruit of tears, pluck and devour.
Pluck and devour. There's advice for the day.
So the head of Lehman Brothers, pretty much, there's video of him saying he likes to rip the hearts out of people, this man that caused the financial collapse. Bless him. He got away with it, though, in case you were worried about it, and was able to walk away scot-free, such is the world we live in. I also like to point out that my cat does not have sour breath. Dogs have sour breath. My cat has lovely breath. She smells wonderful, my cat. So I don't know if that's general, but I've never noticed cats having bad breath. Dogs I have.
Yes.
So maybe James Joyce was confused about reality. I don't know. We come to the great masterwork, which almost nobody can manage to get through.
Would this be Finnegans Wake?
This would be Finnegans Wake, and you may notice that there is no possessive apostrophe in Finnegans, and that is deliberate, because there are two concepts in here, and one is that is the wake of Finnegan. So after Finnegan is buried, there is a wake for him, a big Irish party. Very sensible about death, the Irish, I think. Let's have a big party and celebrate the life of the person. But the other is, it's an instruction. Finnegans Wake, meaning rise from the dead. Time for you
all
to
you Finnegans.
waken. He spent 17 years pretty much locked in a room with his daughter Lucretia, who, when he died of peritonitis, she was she entered an insane asylum where she lived out the rest of her days. She was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and there is speculation that he refused to have anybody else care for her. And so there is speculation that part of the broken language of Finnegans Wake is to do with, I think it's called eulalia, word salad that schizophrenics sometimes move into. There's also an argument that Nora Barnacle wrote Ulysses, but I'm going to dismiss that one immediately. I read a literature professor's book about Joyce, in which he analysed Joyce's work one by one. You get to the last chapter, and he's a professor of English literature, and he says, sadly, I can't say anything about Finnegans Wake because I've never been able to read it. So what we're going to do is provide a link to James Joyce reading Anna Livia Pluribel, which is one of the sections from Finnegans Wake. Now, it's worth saying that everything Joyce did, apart from Giacomo Joyce, is very deeply considered. So he ends Ulysses with the word yes, because it is the most positive word in the English language. He begins Finnegans Wake with the word river run and ends it with the, because it is the most common word in the English language, but it means you go back to the beginning. The river run past Eve and Adams along a commodious ficus. And throughout Finnegans Wake, there are devices that he keeps repeating, two initializations. One of them is ALP, ALP, which is Anna Livia Pluribel. And he will again and again come up with phrases that start, which are acrostics, start with these three letters.
Do we know who she was?
She's a creature of his imagination, but Pluribel, most beautiful. Livia, the River Liffey, and references beyond, because the story begins with the River Liffey in Dublin. And it says, along a commodious vicus. And the vicus is a reference to Jean-Baptiste Vico, a philosopher of the 16th century, I believe, who thought that history was cyclical, that everything just repeats. Thusly, the book begins with the word river run, ends with thus, so you can go back to the beginning. And
We're beginning to get into why people don't read this, aren't we? There's just
but he also
many hidden ideas in it.
And how much of it was intentional is another matter, though I do tend to agree. Joyce put forward the idea that art is something that happens at the interface with the audience, that the meanings you put into something have value. And this is a point where, you know, his narcissistic trend reverses, that he actually accepts that he's saying something, but you may make something better of it than he did, that you might bring to it a richness that he did not. He sought to follow Dante, his great hero, Dante Alighieri, at the beginning of the Renaissance, and the Divine Comedy, and his intention was to write a book about earth, a book about hell, and a book about heaven. Ulysses is the book about earth. Finnegans Wake is the book about hell, and he died before writing the book about heaven. Okay. So we will one day produce that for him using a Ouija board.
That's our project for next month.
It was meant to be a short book. So there you have it, the potted guide to James Augustine Aloysius Joyce. And
the link that we'll put to this section, and Olivia Pluribel, listening to that or listening to Joyce reading anything, I think is well worthwhile. It is fantastic. We hope we've kind of done him credit here.
As well as insulting him a little bit along the way.
But it is wonderful listening to him. Yeah,
I mean, I like the way that T.S. Eliot read. Many people don't, because it's quite flat. We agree that Dylan Thomas's kind of theatrics are a little bit too much. As I was young and time was young, that kind of thing. Joyce, I think, has the perfect reading voice. There are various versions of Anna Livia Pluribel, which was read while he was still working on Finnegans Wake, and I think was recorded by the BBC or something for the radio. There is one where they animate a sculptured bust of Joyce, and I would recommend not watching that, because it's incredibly distracting. You just want to close your eyes and listen to this wonderful voice.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was James Joyce. Thank you very much for watching and sharing your time.
Yes, thank you so much. This has been Lyrical Wax. I'm Jon Atack.
And I'm Ursula Wake. Bye.
Bye-bye.